Welcome to the Does God Exist video presentation, program number 26, the fossil record. I'd like to encourage you to, if you haven't watched the previous program, number 25, in which we introduced what the word evolution means, talked about the difference between the fact of evolution and the theory of evolution, talked about the different theories like punctuated equilibrium, neo-Darwinism, all these fundamental definitions, what the word kind means. It really is rather important for you to do that before you look at this presentation. Because the fossil record is the important part of how we deal with what is true and what is not true about evolution. We pointed out at the end of the last program that there are many biological evidences of evolution. And evolution is an unfolding type of change. And we talked about some of the reasons for that. There's no way you could eat a hamburger if it was chemically different than you are. There are many things that we have learned about how to take care of our bodies, the whole medical foundation based upon the similarities that exist in living things. Our understandings of the genetic source of diseases and the fact that we get a huge number of diseases from animals is all a part of understanding the biological connections between humans and animals and how that connection may have been related in the past. But the real fundamental issue is answered by the fossil record, by the historical record. And we ended the last presentation by quoting from Gracias' ancient textbook on biology the statement about fossils. The process of evolution is revealed only through fossil forms. This makes me rather happy because I don't know as much about biology as I do about fossils. My training is in physics and geology. It's not in biology. So that's one of the reasons why I have spent very little time talking about the biological evidence and why I'm not going to get in great depth into the genetic materials. There are people like Francis Collins who have done that. There are people who have taken much more conservative positions than he has who have done that. And you can read those sources for yourself and evaluate what they have to say. But the fossil record is an important record. It has a lot to say to us, no matter what we believe and no matter what our position is on the discussions that we are having. What can we say about fossils? Well, first of all, they exist. These are fossils that I have found where I live, and I live in Michigan. And as you look at those fossils, it should be fairly obvious to you that those fossils are not the kinds of animals living in Michigan today, not even in Lake Michigan for the most part. The fossils have a message to tell us that there has been change. As a geologist, looking for oil, looking for coal, looking for natural resources that have commercial value, the fossil record is a major tool in understanding where to look. The fact that we found these kinds of fossils in Michigan led people to look around Michigan for oil, and they found it. Look around Michigan for coal, and they found it. We now know that Michigan is a basin, and that in fact there are a number of natural resources like gypsum in Michigan which are produced by environments that are certainly nothing like what is present today. This is important. This is useful. The fossil record tells us about the past. As a matter of fact, Michigan state rock is the Petoskey stone. You're looking at one here. You may have heard of Petoskey stones. If you tumble them, they make beautiful jewelry. But what's interesting about the Petoskey stone is that this stone, this coral, is a tropical coral. It will not grow in water that is any colder than 68 degrees. Do I have to tell you that Michigan is not a tropical paradise? There has been change. And the fossil record tells us about that change. And the fossil record tells us that animals have lived in the past that are not alive today. Look at these shark jaws. Now that's an incredible large shark. And those jaws were not found in the ocean. They were found in Illinois, near the intersection of the Mississippi and the Ohio River. It makes jaws look like a minnow. Look at the size of this tooth from this carcharodon, this large prehistoric shark compared to a giant white shark of today. There has been change. And animals have lived in the past that are radically different than animals living today. Animals we call dinosaurs. Now, I do want to emphasize here that this is a commercial picture. We don't know what color of skin dinosaurs had. There are some recent finds that suggest certain colors that may have been present, but that certainly is not decipherable. So there is much guesswork in this, but these animals existed. You know, sometimes we run into people who don't think they did. When I was a kid, I was driving a guy to the West Coast one time, and we were driving through the central part of the United States. We came to Vernal, Utah. Went by a place called Dinosaur National Park. And the guy's riding in the back seat, and I said to him, "Hey, let's go see the dinosaurs." And his response was, "I don't believe in dinosaurs. I don't want to see any either." Well, you can take that kind of position, but you can't take it intelligently. These animals lived. You say, "Well, how do you know that?" Well, let me tell you a little family story. I have two little girls that grew up in my house, and I was the kind of father who just loved to play jokes on my girls. One summer day, I went out on our patio, and there was this toad that had crawled up on our patio and died, and the sun had baked him out. And here he is, and you're looking at him here in this picture, all dried out, shriveled up. So I thought, well, I'll play a joke on my daughter. So I took the toad and I put him under the bacon on the breakfast table. Now before you health nuts go crazy here, I had a piece of saran wrap over him, so don't get concerned about contamination. Well, my older girl came down, and Kathy's a person who deals with the arts, and she's into architecture and things like that, not much into biological things. She picked up a piece of bacon, saw the toad, and made the desired and anticipated response. "Yuck! Daddy!" And she goes running out of the kitchen. Well, that brings her sister down. Her sister's now a biology teacher, very much into living things. She looks at the toad under the bacon, and she looks at her sister, who's refusing to come in the kitchen until the toad is removed. She looked at me, she rolled her eyes, she picked up the toad, she took him out into my office, and she stapled him to my bulletin board. And that toad is still stuck on my bulletin board. And that little girl is now over 40 years old. And the toad looks like he did the day she put him up there. Now, the process here is dehydration. Fluids were taken out of the animal's body very quickly, and the animal is dehydrated. We have found fossils of ancient humans that have been dehydrated, some of them artificially, such as the Egyptian mummies, some of them naturally, especially in South America and the mountains. So we know what people look like. We have a pretty good idea about how they died. We have great evidence on a whole bunch of different fronts about the history of human change from dehydrated, mummified specimens. But ladies and gentlemen, that is also true of dinosaurs. You're looking at a section of skin from a hadrosaur. That's the animal I showed you a moment ago. As you look at that skin structure, you can see that it's very obvious what the cell structure is. As a matter of fact, as scientists have dug into that, they can actually examine the cells and learn much about what is in the cells, chemically and otherwise. And as I said to you earlier, there's a lot of guesswork in this picture, but there's not much guesswork about how the bones are hooked together, where the skin was, how the skin was functioning, what the animal ate. Sometimes we find baby dinosaurs, like this one, where the cell structure is much smaller. I want to clarify one point here. A lot of people get the idea that dinosaurs were all great, big, huge, monstrous animals, 25 feet tall and all this sort of thing. But you have to understand that most dinosaurs were very small. Lots of dinosaurs have been found that were the size of a Cocker Spaniel. The finding of the huge ones, which is the ones that make the newspapers and Saturday morning cartoons and what have you, is relatively rare. And the largest animal that has ever lived on the earth is still alive today. The blue whale, which is a very large animal, is the largest animal that we know that has ever lived. And even a humpback that you see here compared to an elephant is a massive animal. So we want to emphasize that not all the dinosaurs were great big huge things. But we also have remains that tell us a lot more about the animal. You're looking here at a piece of material called a coprolite. I don't know any polite way to put this. This is dinosaur poop. It's hard. You say, well, how can poop be hard? Well, it's been permineralized. And it's hard. It doesn't have any smell. It doesn't have any taste. You say, yeah, you taste a dinosaur poop? Well, it's been changed. It's been altered. So I'm not going to get dinosaur fever or something of that type. What's interesting is that there's different kinds of dinosaur poop. That's a different type. Two different animals. When you slice this thing, and you can see in this picture the cross section, and you look at it under a microscope, you can tell what this animal had been eating. And what we find when we look at this is plant material. We find stems, we find catelids, we find all kinds of plant remains in this coprolite. Now, if you were walking around in a national park, and if you knew anything about animals, you would recognize the poop from different animals, which would tell you whether the animal has been there. Most of us probably recognize rabbits and deer. But every animal has a characteristic shape to the material and, of course, a different content. And the Smithsonian has rooms of samples of this kind, which can be analyzed. This is an interesting specimen. When you look at this, what you find is that there's 26 different teeth in this dinosaur poop. Whole teeth. There's bone fragments. There's skin pieces. There's no plant material at all. So what did this animal eat? Well, obviously, other animals. And if there's 26 different kinds of teeth, most of which can be identified as to what animal the tooth belonged to, then you can pretty well tell what the animal ate. But this has implications, fossil-wise. It tells us that animals ate other animals during the time of the dinosaurs. It gives us a picture of what was eaten and how it was eaten. Sometimes the structures are incredibly clear. This is a picture that I'm sure you've seen of an ankylosaurus. Let's look at the tail section. By the way, the piece of paper on the left-hand side is an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, which gives you some idea of the size of this. But look at the detail, and possibly even some indication of the color that the animal might have had. Now, not only do we have the actual skin and bones, in this picture you're looking at the eggs of a dinosaur found in place, in situ. Now, when you look at this, it tells you something. First of all, it tells you that the mother had 2 ovaries because the eggs are laid in pairs. You can notice that the nest, if you want to call it that, is a scooped out area. Surrounding this little bathtub-shaped object, there were massive footprints of a large dinosaur. So it appears that it was a nest that was patrolled by the mother. If you look carefully, you can see that there's vegetation packed around the eggs. You're sort of reminded here of an alligator that will make a nest, put the eggs in it, cover it up with vegetation to stabilize the temperature, and then stay around to keep the predators away. What's interesting is that when you cut one of these eggs open, there's a baby inside. And you can see here that quite a bit of detail is present as you look at this dissected egg. So we know something about the embryonic development. We know something about how the babies developed. We have some picture. Some of them are pretty large. Look at the one that the guy has his left hand on. So that tells us something about the history of these animals. In one case, the eggs were found with the mother still sitting on the nest. What you're looking at is her right leg and the eggs underneath her. Let's back up here for just a minute. If you look carefully, you can see her head turned across the top of her body. The eggs are off to the right and underneath. This is embedded in a wind-blown sandstone. So what we believed happened was that the mother had this nest. A large sandstorm came up. She went over and covered the nest to protect the eggs from the blowing sand. But the sandstorm was more extensive than she thought, and she smothered. And so we have this wonderfully preserved specimen, which tells us an enormous amount of detail about how this process of reproduction was carried on and how the animal took care of its eggs. One thing that may impress you as we look at some of these cross-sectioned eggs is how much some of these things look like birds. One of the big questions is, were the dinosaurs birds? Or at least were some of the dinosaurs birds? Because there are what appear to be feather imprints in many cases. And you compare the skull of a modern bird with one of these fossilized forms, you can certainly see the similarities. Sometimes there are vestiges of feathers, but you have to understand that feathers can be used for lots of things. They can be used to snag insects. They don't just have to be used for flight. They can be used for certain types of swimming or running, as is the case with a penguin or an ostrich. But the morphological comparisons with the human arm are very obvious. And so when you see reconstructions, you have to realize that much of what is done in these reconstructions is based upon the fossil evidence. Even soft tissue is sometimes preserved, like this stomach, which gives us some indication, and sometimes food is found in the stomach. And of course, sometimes we find animals still preserved completely intact. This is called amber. Amber is tree sap, like a pine tree, where the sap has oozed out. An animal or a bug gets trapped in the sap, and then because the volatiles evaporate, what you have left is a very hard material, which is called amber. As you can see, lots of different insects preserved in amber. So could you have a mosquito trapped in amber? Well, of course. Could that mosquito have taken blood out of a dinosaur? Well, certainly that's possible. Mosquitoes today can take blood out of a hippopotamus or a crocodile or just about anything. Nothing else, they'll go for soft tissue around the eyes or nose. So could you take the blood out of a mosquito and clone a dinosaur? And if some of you don't know what I'm doing here, this is the scenario of the movie called Jurassic Park, which showed in very imaginative form some theoretical concepts about how dinosaurs might have functioned. And by the way, what they proposed in the film could not happen because amino acids tend to rotate in their handedness. And we may or may not talk about that down through our discussions here, but there is a polarity, a left hand and a right hand, to living and non-living materials, and it tends to change when the animal dies, which means that the kind of thing they proposed to do in Jurassic Park could not actually be done as they did it. But we have found soft tissue in some dinosaur remains, including red blood cells in some, so who knows? But notice in this amber, we have a frog and we have a turtle. By the way, if you're curious, most of these amber collections have been taken from a place in the Ukraine, and the pictures were sent to me by a student there. And they are remarkable, and they do tell us enormous amounts about the past. But there's still another kind of fossil. And this is an interesting scenario because there have been some false claims here. You're looking here at a set of dinosaur tracks. This is from a place called Glen Rose, Texas, although I have been to several places where such tracks exist. The dinosaur tracks are in a limey mud. And you may, as you look at these pictures, you may wonder about the nature of the rock, but it's a very muddy, soft material, but when it gets lime in it, it becomes very, very hard. And in a place called Glen Rose, Texas, which is near Waco, there is a park called Dinosaur State Park, and Glen Rose has had a number of movies made about it. I have been there many, many times. One time when I was there, it was raining. You may think this looks like mud, but again, it's very, very hard rock. If you hit it with a hammer, your rock hammer would just bounce off of it. The rain makes it look soft, but it's not. What I want you to notice here is that there is clear activity on the part of a dinosaur. The animal was moving that direction. The animal decided to go that direction. And the arrows simply tell you the direction of the tracks. So what the animal did was to plant its right foot and press its tail into the mud. You'll notice that to the left of the arrow, there is a tail imprint, and if you come up and look at that closely, you'll see scale imprints in it. And then the animal walked off, step, 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 step. That tells you a lot, gives you information about the animal. You may have heard stories about human tracks and dinosaur tracks being found in the same rock layers in Glen Rose. That is simply not true. I have been there many times. The human tracks are contrived. They are not actual tracks. And if you have a question about that, I can offer you documentation on that. But my point here is that the fossils tell us something. This is an exercise that we used to use in our science program. It actually is from a place called Dinosaur State Park in Hartford, Connecticut. There's a bubble that covers this area. The two reference lines there are about 100 feet apart. So the larger animal is traveling 100 feet in maybe 4 steps. That's stepping right along. And what I always used to enjoy doing was asking my students to give me any reasonable explanation of what happened based on the evidence. Okay, have you made up your mind? Let me tell you my favorite one. I had a little guy, I taught at an inner city school. I had kids that had never been out of the neighborhood. And I had one little guy that came up and he said, I know what happened. I said, what happened? He said, well, Mama Dinosaur backed up and laid an egg. That's from top to bottom. And I said, really? He said, yeah, and she sat on the egg and made sure that when the egg hatched, the baby was okay. So that's what all those tracks are between the two lines. I said, really? He said, yeah, and they were very polite dinosaurs, like Chinese dragons. They backed away from each other very politely, nodding as they went. And I tried very hard not to laugh. But then I said to him, well, okay, I'll give you credit for that if you can offer me any evidence to support it. And he said, well, I can prove it. I said, really? Well, prove it to me. He said, well, look, the footprints in the lower right don't sink in as deep as the footprints at the top. So clearly she got rid of something. I was speechless. He had the right observation, didn't he? Then I thought I had him. I said, yeah, but look at this. The footprints are further apart for the bigger dinosaur between the two lines. How do you explain that? He said, well, you know how it is with parents. They can't wait to get away from the kids. Well, you take whatever explanation you want. The point is, it's a fossil. It has something to tell us about dinosaurs. They were clearly bipedal in this case. I would suggest it indicates carnivorous activity, but you might have a different idea. I've had kids say, no, they were like kangaroos. She put her baby in her pouch. And well, this is an important point. We don't know what the soft tissue was like, so you can't disprove that. Based on the evidence, there's more than one possible explanation. But there is one very, very important point here that needs to be made about what the fossils have to tell us. Evolution is based on a religion, on a faith at least, which is called uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism is the religious belief that no process has ever happened in the past which is not operational today. In the earth science book, the snappy way they say it is, the present is the key to the past. So when we look at a rock deposit, we assume the rock deposit was produced by the same process we see those rock deposits being laid by today. Uniformitarianism. When we look at the way an animal lived, the way they ate, the way they functioned, we assume that nothing mystic was involved in the process. This is the basis of all historical science. The Bible says this isn't necessarily true. The Bible says that periodically throughout history there have been catastrophic events not operational today, which have punctuated the Earth's history. And the classic example of this would probably be the flood. Now we have floods today, but not a flood of the magnitude described in the biblical record. and we'll take a strictly fundamentalist interpretation here, if the whole earth was covered with water of such magnificent amounts that it completely covered Mount Everest or whatever mountains were there at the time, and that existed for a long period of time, that would have a radical effect upon life. If the only life that could survive was marine life and those forms that man chose fit to save, that would be a major change in the history of the earth. That would not be uniformitarian in nature. Now, that's a biblical example, and an atheist won't accept it, so let's look at something that's a little bit more scientific in nature in terms of evidence. You're looking here at something called the periodic chart. I'm sure you've studied this in chemistry class. And you know that elements like carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and so forth, up near the top of the chart, are fundamental in the building blocks of life. Luis Alvarez, at the end of the 20th century, discovered something rather interesting. In the last remains of the dinosaurs, there were unusually large amounts of the elements osmium, rhenium, and iridium. Now, I've circled those on this diagram. This is at the bottom of the chart. Let's go back to the whole chart. It's down low, down near platinum and gold. It's not up near iron and copper and carbon and nitrogen and all those things. Now, some of you are saying, well, I never heard of osmium, rhenium, and iridium. That's right, because they're only found in trace amounts in the Earth's crust today. But in the remains of the last dinosaurs, they're in concentrations 500 times greater than that. So Alvarez had a proposal, which I think has been pretty well been verified in today's world, because we now know that asteroids, large hunks of rock from space, have struck the Earth and left the elements that they are composed of on the Earth, and one of those combinations that is present in the same concentrations found in the Cretaceous deposits of the dinosaurs are the elements osmium, iridium, and rhenium. So the scenario is that at the end of the Cretaceous period, when the dinosaurs became extinct, a large asteroid hit the Earth. As this thing hit the Earth, and by the way, these pictures are from various scientific publications, various websites, and so forth. As these things hit the Earth, they would have vaporized themselves and part of the Earth's crust. But this would have produced monumental effects. If it hit in a water environment, then you would have a nuclear winter effect. Massive amounts of material thrown up into the atmosphere. A tidal wave generated by the collision. What's interesting is that in the Yucatan Peninsula, there is a place that looks very much like this. This is a radar imprint of an area on the Yucatan shoreline. That black line running through the center there is the shoreline. What is indicated by white dots here are forms of material called cenotes, which are quartz minerals produced by very high temperatures and very high pressures. That doesn't happen in a volcano because, well, you can have very high temperatures, you don't have high pressures once the material is extruded. So what is believed is that this is a place where an asteroid hit. If it was on this coastline, there would have been a tidal wave generated in the area around the Gulf, and there is a tsunami line on the opposing shoreline. It's important to understand that this evidence suggests that, in fact, this was a catastrophic event. And since this study, there have been other studies. For instance, in Sudbury, Ontario, pretty good documentation has been given for similar things. This would have thrown massive amounts of material into the Earth's atmosphere, and you would have had a nuclear winter. What's interesting is that it's not just the dinosaurs became extinct. There was a massive drop in photoplankton in the oceans. This was a worldwide event, and it produced massive change, certainly not the kind of thing that is happening today, not a uniformitarian principle. And you can go all the way around the Earth today, and you can see this deposit at the Cretaceous boundary. So the assumption that the present is the key to the past isn't always true, and we only looked at one evidence. There are a variety of evidences in all kinds of different forms that changes of a catastrophic nature have occurred. So any particular concept that is based upon uniformitarianism has to be looked at very, very carefully. Uniformitarianism. is not true. Let me make a closing point here. And that closing point is that when it appears that there is a conflict between science and the Bible, when we really study it, when we investigate it in great detail, what we find is that either we have bad science, we have bad theology, or both. And the lesson of history has been we've had a lot of both. And we'll try to discuss some of that in the next presentation. Welcome to the Does God Exist video presentation, program number 26, the fossil record. I'd like to encourage you to, if you haven't watched the previous program, number 25, in which we introduced what the word evolution means, talked about the difference between the fact of evolution and the theory of evolution, talked about the different theories like punctuated equilibrium, neo-Darwinism, all these fundamental definitions, what the word kind means. It really is rather important for you to do that before you look at this presentation. Because the fossil record is the important part of how we deal with what is true and what is not true about evolution produced by environments that are certainly nothing like what is present today. This is important. This is useful. The fossil record tells us about the past. As a matter of fact, Michigan State rock is the Petoskey stone. You're looking at one here. You may have heard of Petoskey stones. If you tumble them, they make beautiful jewelry. But what's interesting about the Petoskey stone is that this stone, this coral, is a tropical coral. It will not grow in water that is any colder than 68 degrees. Do I have to tell you that Michigan is not a tropical paradise? There has been change. And the fossil record tells us about that change. And the fossil record tells us that animals have lived in the past that are not alive today. Look at these shark jaws. Now that's an incredible large shark. Quoting from Gracias' ancient textbook on biology, the statement about fossils. The process of evolution is revealed only through fossil forms. This makes me rather happy because I don't know as much about biology as I do about fossils. My training is in physics and geology. It's not in biology. So that's one of the reasons why I have spent very little time talking about the biological evidence and why I'm not going to get in great depth into the genetic materials. There are people like Francis Collins who have done that. There are people who have taken much more conservative positions than he has who have done that. And you can read those sources for yourself and evaluate what they have to say. But the fossil record is an important record. It has a lot to say to us, no matter what we believe and no matter what our position is on the discussions that we are having. What can we say about fossils? Well, first of all, they exist. These are fossils that I have found where I live, and I live in Michigan. And as you look at those fossils, it should be fairly obvious to you that those fossils are not the kinds of animals living in Michigan today, not even in Lake Michigan for the most part. The fossils have a message to tell us that there has been change. As a geologist, looking for oil, looking for coal, looking for natural resources that have commercial value, the fossil record is a major tool in understanding where to look. The fact that we found these kinds of fossils in Michigan led people to look around Michigan for oil, and they found it. Look around Michigan for coal, and they found it. We now know that Michigan is a basin, and that in fact there are a number of natural resources like gypsum in Michigan which are ocean. We pointed out at the end of the last program that there are many biological evidences of evolution. And evolution is an unfolding type of change, and we talked about some of the reasons for that. There's no way you could eat a hamburger if it was chemically different than you are. There are many things that we have learned about how to take care of our bodies, the whole medical foundation based upon the similarities that exist in living things. Our understandings of the genetic source of diseases and the fact that we get a huge number of diseases from animals is all a part of understanding the biological connections between humans and animals and how that connection may have been related in the past. But the real fundamental issue is answered by the fossil record, by the historical record. And we ended the last presentation by quoting